Everyone said it was impossible. The Vance triplets couldn't be tamed, couldn't be soothed, couldn't be loved for more than a week. 14 nannies had tried. 14 had failed. But tonight, in the hushed glow of the master bedroom, something unthinkable happened. Before we begin, let us know in the comments section where you are watching from. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and like this video. Your support helps us bring more profound stories that you can't afford to miss. Naomi Clarke lay in the center of the bed, dark curls spilling against the pillow, her breathing deep and steady. On either side of her, 2 small boys were curled close, their tiny arms wrapped around her as though they had known her all their lives. At the foot of the bed, the third child had folded herself into a ball, thumb tucked into her mouth, lashes wet but finally resting. 3 children who never slept, who fought and screamed and terrorized every adult in sight, were silent, peaceful, safe. And then the door swung open. Alexander Vance filled the doorway, his broad shoulders framed by the soft light from the hall. His eyes, sharp and stormy, locked on the scene before him. For a moment he couldn't even speak. He had walked into his own bedroom countless times, but never like this. Never to find a stranger in his bed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice cracked like a whip, low but dangerous. Naomi stirred, blinking awake, the weight of the children anchoring her down. Her heart pounded, but her voice was calm, steady, gentle, so as not to wake them. "They begged me not to leave," she whispered. "They were afraid. I stayed until they calmed." Her words were simple. But to Alexander, they sounded like an intrusion, a trespass. His grief-hardened pride saw not compassion, but disrespect. "You're a maid," he hissed, jaw tightening. "Not their nanny. Not their mother. And certainly not welcome in this bed. Get out. Now." The room seemed to shrink with the force of his rage. But Naomi did not flinch. She didn't argue, didn't beg. Carefully, she leaned down, brushing a kiss against each child's hair. Max, the fiery one, stirred but did not wake. Miles, the quiet one, tightened his grip on her sleeve even in sleep. And Margot, wild little Margot, sighed as though letting go of months of restlessness. Naomi's eyes softened. Then, with deliberate care, she slipped her arm free, slid her shoes into her hand, and rose. She didn't look at Alexander as she walked past him. Her back was straight, her face unreadable. Dignity wrapped around her like a shield. The door clicked softly shut behind her. And Alexander Vance, the man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking, stood frozen. He turned back to the bed, breath tight in his chest. He expected them to stir, to thrash, to cry out the way they always did. Nightmares were their constant companion. Every nanny, every therapist, every prescription had failed. But tonight, nothing. Max's brow, usually furrowed with anger, was smooth. Miles' fingers, always fidgeting, rested quietly on the blanket. And Margot, wild, defiant Margot, slept with her tiny hand pressed against the sheet, peaceful at last. For the first time since their mother's death, there was silence in the Vance mansion. Not the hollow silence of grief. Not the exhausted silence of tantrums burned out. But the soft, fragile quiet of true rest. Alexander's throat tightened. How had this woman, this maid, done what 14 trained professionals couldn't? He stepped closer, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. His reflection in the mirror across the room looked back at him, a man hardened by loss, drowning in control, choking on silence. On the nightstand, something caught his eye. A folded piece of paper. He reached for it, unfolding the page with hands that felt strangely unsteady. The handwriting was neat, careful, deliberate. If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will. No signature. No explanation. Just that. He read it once. Then again. And again. The words pressed into his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't pleaded to keep her position. She had simply left him with truth. The truth that terrified him more than anything, that maybe she was right. Down the hall, the house staff whispered about what had just happened. They had seen the other nannies leave, screaming, crying, cursing the children as demons. They had seen Alexander's coldness, his refusal to bend. They had seen the children spiral deeper into grief. But tonight, for a brief, impossible moment, Naomi Clarke had changed everything. And now, dear viewers, pause with me here. Because this is where our story begins. Not with perfection, not with polished smiles or effortless peace, but with a woman who dared to stay where no one else would. Tell me in the comments below, would you have stayed in that room, with those children, knowing their reputation? Alexander sat in the dim light of his bedroom, the note trembling slightly in his hand. The silence of the house pressed in on him. For the first time in months, his children weren't crying. For the first time in months, someone had left behind more than chaos. Naomi had left behind peace. And Alexander Vance, the man who had everything, realized he had no idea what to do with it. The Vance estate was a fortress of glass and marble, a place designed to impress from the first glance. The iron gates opened with a slow groan, revealing manicured lawns, fountain-spitting arcs of water, and hedges cut to geometric perfection. From the outside, it looked like order, wealth sculpted into symmetry. But inside? Inside was war. Naomi Clarke stepped over the threshold just as a vase crashed to the floor, porcelain shattering into 100 pieces at her feet. She flinched at the sound, but not enough to retreat. The mansion's foyer stretched high above her, a chandelier dangling like a crown of glass. But any elegance the house might have claimed was drowned out by chaos. A nanny, her white blouse stained with orange juice, her hair in frazzled strands, was dragging a suitcase down the stairs 2 steps at a time. Behind her, a little boy hurled a spoon that clanged against the banister. "They're demons!" the nanny cried, pointing at the children with trembling hands. "Demons in human skin. I won't last another hour." She rushed past Naomi without a second glance, muttering curses under her breath as the front door slammed behind her. Naomi's eyes moved to the source of the racket. 3 children. Identical in their sharp features, in the golden-brown hair that fell into their eyes, but different in every other way. Max, the oldest by mere minutes, stood at the bottom of the staircase, fists clenched, his jaw set in permanent defiance. His eyes burned with a fury too heavy for a child his age. Miles, the quiet middle one, lingered at the edge of the chaos. He clutched a toy car so tightly his knuckles turned white, his lips pressed together. His silence was louder than any tantrum. And Margot, the youngest, though you'd never guess it, was standing on the foyer table, spaghetti dripping from her curls as she flung fistfuls of noodles against the wall. Her laughter rang out like a dare. Naomi took it all in. The broken vases. The juice stains on the carpet. The walls already scarred by flying cutlery and crayon wars. And the children, fierce and unruly, daring the world to give up on them. Most people would have turned around right then. But Naomi didn't. She smoothed the apron she wore over her plain dress and stepped forward. "Good afternoon," she said softly, her voice carrying steady against the noise. Max narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" "The new maid," Naomi replied. "Naomi Clarke." Miles said nothing, just watched her with suspicious eyes. Margot lobbed one last strand of spaghetti that landed squarely on Naomi's shoe. "Bet you don't last a week." Naomi bent down, plucked the spaghetti from her shoe, and set it neatly on the table beside her. Her movements were calm, unhurried, deliberate. "Maybe," she said. "But you'll get tired of testing me before I get tired of staying." The triplets froze, unused to an answer that wasn't a threat, a bribe, or a scream. A deep voice cut through the air behind her. "She's right about one thing," Alexander Vance said, stepping into the foyer. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression cold as stone. He didn't look at the broken vase, or the noodles, or the suitcase abandoned at the door. He looked only at Naomi, sizing her up like another problem to be solved, or discarded. "You." His brow furrowed, disbelief dripping from the single word. "A maid." Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir." "They'll eat you alive," he said flatly. Naomi let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried steel beneath it. "Then I'll cook something better for them to chew on." For the first time, Alexander faltered. Just for a second. The children's eyes darted between the 2 adults, sensing the shift. Naomi turned her attention back to the triplets. "Max," she said gently, her gaze firm. "Put down your fists. You're not fighting me." Max blinked. No one ever called him out so directly. Slowly, reluctantly, his fists unclenched. "Miles." Naomi crouched so her eyes were level with his. You don't have to talk yet. But when you're ready, I'll be listening. Miles' grip on the toy car loosened just enough that it didn't look painful anymore. And Margot. Naomi looked at the girl, spaghetti still dripping from her curls. Tables are for plates, not people. Get down. Margot grinned, daring her to try. Make me. Naomi didn't raise her voice. Didn't threaten. She just walked over, lifted Margot gently but firmly off the table, and set her on the floor. There. That's better. Margot blinked, stunned. Nobody had ever just done it. Alexander watched all of this unfold with arms crossed, skepticism etched into every line of his face. You think rules will fix them, he muttered. Naomi straightened. Not rules, she said. Boundaries. Love has boundaries. The words hung in the air like something sacrilegious in that mansion. The staff who had lingered in the hall to witness the scene exchanged glances. Some stifled chuckles, others shook their heads. They'd seen it before, new hires with soft hearts who thought they could survive the Vance triplets. None had lasted. But Naomi Clarke wasn't blinking. The chaos didn't disappear that day. Max still kicked at the banister when he didn't get his way. Miles still refused to answer questions. Margot still climbed onto the kitchen counter when no one was looking. But something was different. When Max tried to hurl a glass at the wall, Naomi caught his wrist midair, her grip firm but not cruel. We don't break what we can't fix, she told him, making him place the glass back on the table. When Miles went silent during dinner, Naomi didn't force him to speak. She simply slid the bread basket his way and said, "Take what you need." He did. When Margot climbed onto the grand piano, Naomi scooped her off and whispered, "If you want to be high, I'll get you a stool. But you don't dance on music." Margot blinked, confused, but for once she obeyed. And Alexander? He lingered in the shadows of doorways, watching, his face unreadable. This maid, this woman who had walked into the ruins of his household, wasn't flinching. She wasn't bribing or begging or storming out with tears. She was simply staying. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, that unsettled him more than the chaos ever had. Because Naomi Clarke wasn't supposed to last. But even on her first day, it was clear. She wasn't like the others. She was the maid who stayed. The day began deceptively quiet. Sunlight spilled across the marble floors of the Vance mansion, warming the cold glass walls. For a moment, it almost looked like the kind of home people envied. But quiet in this house was never peace, it was plotting. Naomi Clarke should have known. By now she'd been in the house long enough to sense when the triplets were scheming. The silence of Max, Miles, and Margot was always the prelude to chaos. Still, she allowed herself a breath of calm as she folded fresh linens in the laundry room. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wanted to believe the children were resting, maybe reading, maybe, for once, being children instead of terrors. But the silence stretched too long. And then came the sound. A faint giggle, quickly muffled. A whisper of small feet running across tiles. And then, click. The door to the laundry room swung shut. Naomi turned, frowning, just in time to hear the snick of a lock sliding into place from the outside. She tried the handle. Firm. Jammed. She knocked once. Max? Margot? Miles? Giggles erupted on the other side of the door, followed by the unmistakable slap of something wet hitting tile. Naomi exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a beat. Of course. The pantry prank. It was a classic. She'd read about it in the caretaker logs stacked in the kitchen, the ones left behind by all the nannies who had lasted no more than a week. Locked in pantry, children spread food everywhere. Quit next morning. Naomi leaned against the wall, folded her arms, and simply waited. Meanwhile, chaos bloomed in the kitchen. Spaghetti sauce splattered across cabinets, red streaks like a crime scene. Flour rained from above as Margot appended an entire bag, twirling in the white dust like a snowstorm of her own making. Max hurled eggs at the walls with grim determination, each splat followed by a satisfied grunt. And Miles, though quieter, had joined in, methodically painting ketchup lines across the refrigerator door like a mural. By the time Mrs. Keller, the longtime housekeeper, peeked in, the kitchen looked like a battlefield. "Oh, Lord have mercy," she muttered, crossing herself. She didn't step further, just turned on her heel muttering, "I'll not be the one to deal with this." "No, ma'am. Not again. The staff had learned. Let the children win, or let the nanny lose. That was the rule. And Naomi Clarke? She was supposed to be gone within the hour. Inside the locked room, Naomi checked her watch. 5 minutes. 10. She could hear the destruction echoing down the hall. Every slam, every shriek, every crash was designed to make her quit. But she didn't pound on the door. Didn't scream. Didn't beg release. She waited. At last, a shadow slipped under the crack in the door, followed by a whisper. Margot's. Bet she's crying. Max's voice came next, smug. Bet she's packing her bags. Miles whispered nothing at all, but Naomi could feel him there, listening. Testing. She pressed her lips together, fighting back a smile. Children always expected one of two reactions, anger or surrender. They never knew what to do with patience. When the door finally swung open, Naomi stepped out as if she'd simply been on her way somewhere else. Her dress was neat, her apron unwrinkled, her face calm. The triplets froze, covered head to toe in flour, sauce, and egg yolk. Margot's hair stuck out in stiff clumps, Max's fists were stained orange with cheese dust, and Miles had ketchup smeared across his cheek like war paint. They were ready for yelling. Ready for threats. Ready for her to storm out. Instead, Naomi walked to the sink, rolled up her sleeves, and filled a basin with warm water. Line up, she said softly. The three blinked at her. Now. Something in her tone, not loud, not harsh but steady, made Max shuffle forward first. She wiped his hands clean with a cloth, then guided him to the table. Next came Margot, giggling nervously as Naomi picked spaghetti from her curls. And then Miles, who didn't resist when she dabbed the ketchup from his face. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of running water. When all three were clean enough to see the shame creeping in, Naomi finally looked around the room. Impressive, she said lightly. You've managed flour, sauce, eggs, and ketchup. That's 4 food groups in one disaster. Margot stifled a laugh. Max scowled, but his ears turned pink. Miles stared at his shoes. But here's the thing, Naomi continued, her voice calm as ever. You made this mess. Which means you'll clean it. Their heads shot up in unison. You can't make us, Max spat. Naomi arched a brow. Watch me. And so it began. She tied dish rags around their waists like aprons and handed each of them a sponge. Max grumbled but scrubbed at the cabinets. Margot splashed more than she cleaned, but she wiped the counters all the same. Miles moved the slowest, dragging his sponge in deliberate strokes across the refrigerator door. Every protest, every complaint, Naomi met with the same unshaken answer, keep going. By the time the floor was clean and the flour had been swept, the children were panting, cheeks flushed from the effort. Naomi handed them plates of the salvaged spaghetti. Sit. Max narrowed his eyes. Why? Because you're going to eat what you wasted. They sat. They ate. And though they tried to mask it, though Max rolled his eyes and Margot swung her feet under the table, there was something new in their posture. Something like respect. Grudging, fragile, but real. What Naomi didn't know was that Alexander had come home early that day. He stood half hidden in the shadow of the hallway, watching. He had seen the pantry trick before, had heard the shrieks of chaos, had witnessed the inevitable storm out of every woman who tried to last in this house. But Naomi Clarke? She hadn't screamed. She hadn't left. She had cleaned them, fed them, and made them face the consequences of their choices. Alexander's jaw tightened. He didn't know whether to feel impressed or threatened. Because for the first time in years, someone other than him had managed to bring order into his house. And it unsettled him more than the chaos ever had. That night, when the children were tucked into bed, Naomi passed by the kitchen one last time. The room smelled faintly of lemon soap, the tiles gleaming under the light. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole. She exhaled, tugging her apron loose. The day had been long. Grueling. And yet, not hopeless. For the first time, the triplets had been forced to face themselves. For the first time, they had looked at her not as prey, but as something closer to, what? A wall that wouldn't crumble? A voice that didn't waver? Maybe the word was simple. A mother. And though none of them would admit it, not even Naomi herself, the first threads of respect had been sewn into the fabric of that house. Fragile threads, yes. But threads strong enough to hold. Because this was no ordinary maid. This was Naomi Clarke. And she had stayed. The kitchen still smelled faintly of lemon soap the next morning. Sunlight glinted off countertops that, only a day earlier, had looked like a battlefield. The echoes of laughter, tantrums, and defiance had given way to a fragile quiet. Naomi Clarke stood at the sink, rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes. She hummed softly under her breath, a lullaby, though no child in this house had ever heard it. Behind her, the triplets ate at the table. Max shoveled scrambled eggs with more focus than usual, Miles nibbled toast in silence, and Margot swung her legs back and forth as she sipped orange juice. It wasn't peace, not really. But it was something close enough to surprise the staff hovering in the doorway. Mrs. Keller, arms folded, leaned toward another maid and whispered, "She lasted through the pantry trick." The younger maid's eyes widened. Impossible. Yet here she is. Mrs. Keller's gaze shifted to Naomi. Don't know if that makes her foolish or extraordinary. But Naomi didn't hear them. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. As Miles wiped his mouth on his sleeve, ignoring the napkin folded neatly beside him, she caught a glimpse of the gesture she used to scold in her own son. Her chest tightened. Ethan would have been 7 by now. The thought came unbidden, sharp as glass. She pressed her lips together, rinsing the dish a little harder than necessary. It had been 3 years since the fever took him. 3 years since the night she rocked him in her arms, begging for breath that never came. The doctors had said complications, words too sterile to contain the devastation of a mother watching her child fade. Grief had not left her, it never did, but it had reshaped her. Smoothed her edges. Patience carved from pain. She understood tantrums. She understood silence. She understood recklessness. Because she had seen all 3 in her son during those endless nights of sickness. Anger at his body, silence when he was too weak to speak, reckless bursts of play when he wanted to forget he was ill. So when Max glared in fury, when Miles retreated inward, when Margot turned the world into a game of chaos, Naomi did not flinch. She had already walked through storms greater than theirs. Alexander Vance, on the other hand, lived in a storm he refused to face. That afternoon, Naomi passed his study and caught a glimpse of him at the desk. Papers spread in perfect stacks, his suit jacket draped over the chair, his tie loosened just enough to suggest fatigue but not surrender. In his hand was a photograph, a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. His wife. The photo slipped from his hand onto the desk, and he rubbed his temples. For a moment his face cracked, the steel mask breaking to reveal exhaustion, guilt, and something deeper. Naomi lingered in the hallway, unseen, watching. She didn't need to know details. She could see it in the way his fingers hovered over the picture, afraid to touch it too long. In the way his shoulders curled inward, as though carrying weight no wealth could ease. The children's wild grief mirrored his own. But unlike them, Alexander had buried his beneath work, control, and silence. Naomi exhaled softly, stepping away. 2 parents, 2 different graves. One buried a child. The other buried a wife. Both were walking ghosts, tethered to what they had lost. The staff noticed things before anyone else. They always did. By evening, gossip buzzed through the servants' quarters like flies on honey. She's gotten close to them already. I saw Max holding her hand yesterday. Max. The devil himself. Miles let her sit beside him while he played. He hasn't let anyone that near in months. And Margot, she hasn't climbed the piano once today. She followed the maid into the garden instead. It isn't natural. Whispers twisted into warnings. She's overstepping. Too much too soon. What happens when Mr. Vance finds out the children prefer her company? Mark my words, it won't end well. The wealthy never forgive the help for stepping out of place. Naomi heard fragments of the gossip when she passed by. She didn't respond. She had grown used to whispers long before this mansion. Whispers about being too soft, too black, too poor, too unqualified. None of it had stopped her before. But here, the stakes were heavier. These weren't just whispers about her. They were whispers about the children, and what it meant for them to need her. That night, Naomi tucked the triplets into bed. Max, stubborn as ever, insisted he wasn't tired. His eyelids betrayed him, heavy with sleep. Naomi smoothed his hair, her voice low. You don't have to fight everything, Max. Miles curled into his blanket, clutching his toy car. Naomi rested her hand lightly on his back, steady as an anchor. You don't have to speak yet. Just rest. Margot wriggled, fighting stillness, but Naomi kissed her curls and whispered, the world can wait until morning. Slowly, one by one, they surrendered to sleep. Naomi sat for a moment longer, watching. The ache of memory pressed in, the weight of Ethan's small frame against her chest, the lullabies that never worked, the silence after his last breath. She blinked back the sting in her eyes, whispering into the quiet, I couldn't save you, my love. But maybe I can save them. Across the hall, Alexander stood in his doorway, half hidden. He had seen her bend over his children, her hand steady, her voice soft. He had seen them surrender to her care. And something inside him twisted, resentment, yes, but also a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But hope was dangerous. So he closed his door, shutting it out. The Vance mansion slept, but not in peace. Naomi lay awake in her small room at the far end of the hall, listening to the wind pressing against the windows. Grief still lived in her bones. She carried it like a shadow. But unlike Alexander, she had learned to live alongside it, not bury it. That was why she stayed calm when chaos reigned. Why she did not leave when others fled. Why she could face 3 broken children and see not demons, but wounds. Because Naomi Clarke had already lived through the worst loss. And she had learned the secret no one else in that mansion knew. Grief doesn't destroy love. It deepens it. The days that followed brought something unfamiliar into the Vance mansion. Not peace, not yet. But change. It was subtle at first. The triplets' tantrums came less like hurricanes and more like summer storms, loud, messy, but shorter, easier to endure. Naomi Clarke moved among them with steady patience, a quiet presence that seemed to draw them toward her in ways no one had managed before. On a rainy afternoon, Naomi sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, sketchbook open. Pencils scattered like tiny soldiers around her. Miles, always the quiet one, hovered at the edge of the rug with his toy car clutched in hand. Naomi looked up. You like to draw? He didn't answer. His silence was armor. She smiled gently, not pressing. Instead, she began to draw. A tree first. Then 3 children beneath it. Slowly, she turned the sketchbook toward him. Miles edged closer. His eyes lingered. Then carefully, he set his car aside and picked up a blue pencil. Without a word, he bent over the page and began to add a sky. Naomi didn't speak. She only watched as the boy who had spoken barely 3 words in days poured himself into colors. When he finished, he pushed the page toward her. A single word slipped out, barely audible. Keep. Naomi's throat tightened. I will. Miles hadn't drawn for anyone since his mother died. The staff whispered about it later that night, astonished. But Naomi knew better than to trumpet victory. Healing wasn't loud. It was quiet. Like blue skies filling a page. Max was fire, quick to rage, quicker to slam doors. His anger lived like a storm behind his eyes. But Naomi began to notice the pattern. The flare-ups came when Alexander didn't show up. Missed dinners. Empty promises of bedtime stories. One evening, when Max hurled a chessboard across the study after Alexander failed to arrive home, Naomi didn't scold. She knelt, gathered the pieces, and looked him in the eye. You're not angry at the board, Max. His jaw tightened. You're angry because your father wasn't here. The boy's fists clenched, his lips pressed together, but his eyes, those betrayed him. Naomi rested a hand on the scattered chess pieces. Breaking things won't make him stay. But telling him how you feel, that might. For the first time, Max didn't storm off. He sat. Quiet. Still. Later that week, Alexander came home late again. Max didn't throw a tantrum. He stood in front of his father, trembling but unbroken, and said, You missed it. Again. Naomi watched from the hall as Alexander froze, unprepared. It wasn't obedience that silenced Max's anger. It was Naomi showing him another way to speak it. Margot, the youngest, hid her grief in chaos. She climbed furniture, toppled bookshelves, sought danger as if it might distract her from the emptiness left behind. One night, Naomi woke to the sound of tiny feet padding across the hall. When she opened her door, she found Margot standing there in her nightgown, eyes wide, clutching a blanket. "I can't sleep," the girl whispered. "It's too dark." Naomi's heart softened. She knelt and opened her arms. Margot crept in, curling against her like she had belonged there all along. That night, Margot slept in Naomi's bed. And the next night. And the one after that. By the end of the week, it was no secret in the mansion that Margot had chosen Naomi's room over her own. Some staff smirked, others frowned. But for Margot, it was simple: she had found safety. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Alexander Vance noticed. Of course he did. At dinner one evening, he sat at the head of the long table, wine glass untouched. His sharp gaze lingered on Naomi, who guided the children through their meal with firm patience, reminding Max to use his fork, coaxing Miles into conversation, laughing gently when Margot made a face at her peas. The children leaned toward her, their voices brighter, their eyes softer. It made something hot curl in Alexander's chest. Not admiration. Not yet. Something closer to resentment. After the children were dismissed, he called Naomi into his study. "You're overstepping." Naomi raised her brows, calm. "Overstepping? You're a maid. Not their mother. Not their teacher. Not their nurse. Yet somehow, you've decided to be all three." His voice was low, sharp, dangerous. Naomi met his gaze steadily. "Because someone had to." His jaw tightened. "You presume too much." "And you, Mr. Vance," Naomi replied softly, "presume too little. You think money fills the holes grief leaves. But your children don't need a provider. They need a father." The words struck like a slap. Alexander's knuckles whitened against the arm of his chair. "You forget yourself." "No," Naomi said quietly. "I remember myself all too well. I'm someone who lost a child. And I see the same pain in your children every day. If speaking the truth means forgetting my place, then perhaps your place is the one that needs changing." Silence fell heavy between them. Alexander's breath came harsh, his glare sharp. But Naomi didn't flinch. She held his gaze until he looked away first. By the end of that week, rumors began to seep beyond the mansion walls. At a charity luncheon downtown, whispers swirled around crystal glasses and silver spoons. "Have you heard? Alexander Vance's children are practically being raised by a maid." "A maid? My God." "One of the staff told me she eats with them. Sleeps with them even. Scandalous. Unthinkable. Poor man. He must be desperate." What began as gossip among the wealthy soon became speculation in social columns. Naomi's name never appeared, but the implication was clear: Alexander Vance, ruthless tycoon, was letting his children be shaped not by tutors or governesses, but by someone beneath their station. When the whispers reached Alexander, he poured himself another scotch, staring out the window of his office. He hated society's judgment. But what cut deeper was not their scorn. It was the truth beneath it: his children did cling to Naomi more than him. That night, Alexander confronted Naomi again. "They talk about you, you know. My colleagues. My so-called friends. They say I've let a maid take my wife's place." Naomi folded a blanket at the end of the sofa. "And do you believe them?" His voice dropped, bitter. "I believe you've blurred the lines." She looked up, steady and unafraid. "The only lines I've crossed are the ones your children drew out of desperation. They asked me to stay. To listen. To care. Can you say the same, Mr. Vance?" Alexander opened his mouth, but no words came. Naomi's tone softened, but her eyes remained firm. "Respect isn't given by title. It's earned by presence. Your children respect me because I stayed when everyone else left. And if that feels like resistance to you, perhaps you should ask why." Her words lingered long after she left the room. Alexander sank into his chair, staring at the decanter of amber liquid he no longer wanted. For the first time, he wondered if the real resistance wasn't Naomi's, but his own. In the quiet of her small room, Naomi tucked Margot against her side, listening to the girls breathing even out. Max's chessboard sat repaired on her nightstand, and Miles's drawing lay folded in her drawer. She whispered to the sleeping child, though the words were meant for the man down the hall. They don't need me to be their mother. They just need me not to leave. And though Alexander Vance would never admit it out loud, he was beginning to realize that was exactly what terrified him most. The letter arrived on cream-colored paper, embossed with gold trim and sealed with a wax crest. It looked elegant, refined, but the weight of it struck Alexander Vance like a blade. Inside, words sprawled across the page in cold, legal precision. Petition for custody. Filed by none other than Charles and Margaret Ellison, the parents of his late wife. They were demanding guardianship of Max, Miles, and Margot. The accusation was blunt. Alexander Vance was an unfit father. And their evidence? The children were abandoned to the care of a maid. Alexander sat in his study, jaw tight, scotch untouched at his elbow. Naomi stood near the doorway, hands folded, eyes low as Mrs. Keller finished reading the letter aloud. Unfit, Alexander muttered under his breath, fingers drumming against the desk. His voice was harsh, brittle. They think they can take my children because you. Naomi looked up slowly. She didn't flinch, though his words stung like ash. Because I stayed? Silence cracked the room. Even Mrs. Keller looked between them, unsettled. Alexander pushed up from his chair, pacing toward the window. Beyond the glass, the children were in the garden, Naomi's rules turning their play into something calmer than weeks before. But the sound of their laughter only deepened the knot in his chest. They'll drag us through the courts, he said, voice low. They'll smear me in public, strip me bare in front of society. And they'll drag you down with me. Naomi's throat tightened, but her voice held. If it means fighting for those children, let them. He turned sharply. Their eyes locked, his full of fire, hers of quiet steel. And though he didn't say it, a flicker of doubt crept in. Maybe she had more courage than him. The courtroom was lined with polished oak, the smell of varnish sharp in the air. Naomi sat behind Alexander, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Charles and Margaret Ellison sat across the aisle, their posture regal, their lawyer polished and ruthless. Margaret's eyes flicked toward Naomi with icy disdain, as though the maid's very presence was an insult to their daughter's memory. The Ellisons' attorney wasted no time. These children, he began, have endured the trauma of losing their mother. And now they are subjected to neglect, instability, and unqualified care. Mr. Vance, consumed by business affairs, has left their upbringing to a domestic servant. 14 nannies in 1 year, and now, a maid who presumes to replace a mother. Naomi's cheeks burned, but she didn't lower her gaze. She kept her eyes forward, even as whispers rippled through the gallery. Alexander's attorney countered with sharp defiance. Mr. Vance provides for his children. They remain in their home, surrounded by familiarity and stability. Removing them would cause further harm. But the Ellisons' lawyer pressed, leaning forward. Stability? With a maid tucked into their bedrooms? With no qualifications, no credentials, no family connection? Tell me, Mr. Vance, would your late wife have wanted her children raised by staff? Gasps spread through the court. Alexander's jaw tightened. Naomi's hands trembled. The judge's gavel struck wood, restoring order, but the words hung heavy. By the second hearing, Naomi herself was called to testify. She walked to the stand with measured steps, heart pounding. The oath left her lips soft and steady. I do. The Ellisons' lawyer wasted no time. State your name for the court. Naomi Clarke. Occupation. She hesitated only briefly. I was hired as house staff. A maid. Whispers surged. The lawyer's smile was cold. A maid. And yet, Miss Clarke, you eat with the children? Sleep in their rooms? Discipline them. I care for them, Naomi answered simply. You presume to take the role of mother? Her throat tightened. Images of Margot in her arms at night, Miles sketching quietly beside her, Max confronting his father, all flashed through her mind. She steadied herself. No. I don't presume. But they need someone who stays. And I stayed. The gallery stirred. The lawyer's smile vanished. Tell me, Miss Clarke, do you hold a degree in child psychology? Formal training as a nanny? Any professional credentials at all? No. Then why should this court believe you are fit to have any role in these children's upbringing? Her hands trembled, but her voice remained even. Because when no one else would listen, I did. When no one else could calm them, I did. Not with degrees. Not with titles. With love. And with patience. For a brief moment, silence held the room. But then the lawyer struck hard. Love does not make you qualified. It makes you dangerous. You are an employee, Miss Clarke. Nothing more. Naomi lowered her eyes, her dignity intact but her heart heavy. That evening, back at the mansion, the triplets clung to her like shadows. Max, fists balled, whispered, "They can't take us." Miles buried his face in her side, silent tears wetting her dress. And Margot, voice trembling, asked the question Naomi couldn't bear, "If they win, will you leave us?" Naomi bent down, pulling them all close. "I'm not going anywhere. Not unless someone drags me out the door. And even then, you'll still have me." They didn't understand the weight of the law, the cruelty of courts. But they understood her promise. And for the first time Alexander, watching from the doorway, saw the truth with painful clarity. His children weren't clinging to him. They were clinging to Naomi. Late that night, Alexander sat in his study, the case files scattered across his desk. The Ellisons' accusations gnawed at him. Unfit father. Neglect. A maid in place of a mother. And damn it, part of him feared they were right. He stared at a photograph of his late wife, her smile radiant, her arms around the triplets when they were younger. Grief burned in his chest. He whispered, "I've failed them." From the shadows, Mrs. Keller's voice rose. "Maybe you have. But she hasn't." Alexander looked up sharply. Mrs. Keller's eyes softened. "Naomi has given those children something you couldn't, not because you don't love them, but because you don't know how to reach them. She does. And if you want to keep them, you'd better start seeing her not as liability, but as your only chance." Her words hit hard. Alexander sat back, realization dawning. Naomi wasn't the problem. She was the anchor. The next morning, Naomi walked through the hall with Margot tugging her hand, Miles clutching his sketchbook, and Max trailing protectively behind her. Their little feet echoed against the marble. At the end of the corridor, Alexander stood waiting. For once, his eyes weren't cold. They were conflicted, almost vulnerable. "Miss Clarke," he said quietly, "we'll fight this. Together." It wasn't an admission. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And though Naomi didn't smile, her chest eased for the first time since the summons arrived. Because in that moment, she knew Alexander Vance no longer saw her as just the maid. He saw her as the only one who could keep his family from breaking apart. The house was silent that night, too silent. The triplets had gone to bed hours earlier, worn down from the strain of the hearings. Naomi sat in her small room, folding laundry by hand, her mind replaying the courtroom again and again. The pointed looks, the cruel laughter, the words made, nothing more. She had told herself she was strong enough to bear it. But even strength wears thin. Down the hall, Alexander's study lamp still burned. He hadn't left the room since dinner. Near midnight, Naomi carried a folded stack of fresh linen toward the storage closet. As she passed the study, she heard the crash of glass. She froze. Then came Alexander's voice, hoarse and sharp. "Useless. All of it. Damn useless." She stepped into the doorway. The Scotch decanter lay shattered across the floor. Papers were strewn across the desk, photographs overturned. And Alexander stood behind it all, his tie loosened, his shirt half unbuttoned, his face twisted with exhaustion and fury. "Mr. Vance." "Don't," he snapped, his voice slicing through the air. "Don't look at me like that. Don't speak to me like you know." Naomi steadied her breath. "The children. The children." He laughed bitterly, dragging a hand down his face. "What do you know of my children, Miss Clarke? You've been here, what, weeks? Months? You think you understand them? You think you understand me?" Naomi's pulse quickened, but her voice stayed calm. "I understand what I see. 3 children aching for their father." His eyes blazed. "Don't lecture me about my own family. You," his voice cracked into a roar. "You've been undermining me since the day you arrived. Crawling into their affections. making me weak. The last word hissed from his lips like poison. For a heartbeat, Naomi said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the folded linens until her knuckles whitened. Then she set them carefully on the desk between them. Weak, she repeated softly. He turned away, pacing toward the window, shoulders rigid. Naomi's voice sharpened. No, Mr. Vance. Weakness is hiding behind money while your children beg for your love. The words cut through the room like a blade. Alexander spun, eyes wide with shock. His chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not his board, not his friends, not even his late wife in her darkest anger. Naomi took a step closer, her voice trembling with restrained fire. You think I make you weak? No. I forced you to see what you've ignored. Max's anger, Miles's silence, Margot's fear. They're not demons. They're children crying out for their father. And you, she pointed a finger at his chest, you've mistaken grief for an excuse to run. His breath caught. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Naomi's tone softened, but it didn't waver. You loved their mother. I don't doubt that. But she's gone. And they're still here. They don't need a perfect father. They just need you. The man who won't come when they cry, because he's drowning in guilt. Silence fell heavy. Alexander stood rooted, trembling in place, the truth burning in his chest. His voice, when it came, was broken. You think I don't know? You think I don't replay it every night? Naomi's brow furrowed. Replay what? That it was my fault. His voice cracked, raw, stripped of its usual steel. She was driving to meet me. Late at night. In the rain. If I hadn't insisted, he pressed his hands against his temples, gasping. She'd still be alive. The words hit Naomi like a blow. For the first time, the mask of Alexander Vance, ruthless tycoon, cold provider, cracked wide enough to reveal the bleeding man beneath. She wanted to reach out. To steady him. But she held her ground. Carrying guilt doesn't honor her memory, Naomi whispered. Being there for your children does. His eyes lifted to hers, wet, desperate, angry all at once. And in that moment, Naomi realized she had seen more of his truth than anyone else in years. The tension broke with her exhale. She shook her head, her own pain rising like a tide. This house will break me too, she said quietly. I can't keep fighting alone. Not against them. Not against you. Alexander flinched. Naomi turned, gathering the linens from the desk. Her steps were steady, but her heart ached with every one. She reached the doorway. And then, Mama Naomi? The small voice froze her in place. Margot stood at the end of the hall, hair mussed from sleep, clutching her blanket. Behind her, Max rubbed his eyes. Miles clutched his sketchbook. All three triplets stared down the hall, wide-eyed and trembling. Don't leave us, Max said, his voice rough. Miles stepped forward, silent but fierce, holding his sketchbook out like an offering. On the page was a crude drawing, Naomi in the center, the three of them around her, hands holding hers. Naomi's throat tightened. She dropped the linens and knelt, arms open. The children rushed into her, burying themselves against her chest, whispering, Stay, please stay. Alexander watched from the study doorway, his face pale, his body rigid. The sight of his children clinging to Naomi, not him, not their blood, shattered something inside him. Naomi smoothed Margot's hair, kissed Miles's forehead, and held Max's shaking shoulders. Then she looked up at Alexander, her eyes fierce. This, she said softly, is not weakness. This is what it means to stay. For the first time in months, Alexander Vance had no reply. He sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the wreckage of his study, at the woman in the hallway holding his children together with nothing but arms and courage. And he knew, though he would never say it out loud, that without her, the mansion would collapse into emptiness. Naomi carried the triplets back to their room, tucking them in gently, humming an old hymn under her breath. Their small hands clung to hers until sleep softened their faces. When she rose to leave, Max stirred, mumbling through drowsy lips, Don't let him send you away. Her chest ached. I'll fight to stay. Outside the door, Alexander lingered in the shadows. He heard her words. He saw the way the children clung to her like their last tether. And for the first time in years, Alexander Vance felt smaller than the storm he tried to command. Because Naomi Clarke, a maid he had once dismissed, had just shown him what true strength looked like. The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, the kind of place where lives were rearranged with signatures and words on record. Outside, cameras flashed like lightning, reporters pressing microphones against the air as Alexander Vance cut a path through the frenzy. His children were ushered in through a side door, hidden from the spectacle. At his side walked Naomi Clarke, quiet and steady, her hands folded as though in prayer. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Charles and Margaret Ellison, seated like royalty at the opposing table, wore expressions carved from stone. Their attorney stood tall, his voice carrying smooth and sharp through the room. "Your Honor, this is not merely about custody. It is about safety, stability, and dignity. These children, grieving their mother, have been thrust into chaos. 14 nannies in less than a year. And now they are in the hands of a maid." The word maid echoed like a slur. He let it linger before continuing. "A domestic servant presuming to act as mother, teacher, nurse, moral compass. This is not stability. This is neglect." Gasps and whispers rippled through the gallery. Naomi kept her chin high, though her stomach knotted. The lawyer pivoted toward Alexander. "And as for Mr. Vance, yes, he provides financially. But presence? Affection? Stability? No. His children are raised not by him, but by an employee. What kind of father hides behind money while his children beg for love?" Alexander sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his hands white-knuckled against the table. He did not speak, but Naomi felt the words land like blows. The attorney pressed the final nail. "These children deserve better than half-love and improper guardianship. The Ellisons can provide a home of dignity, education, tradition. The right home." Then Naomi heard her own name. Called to the stand, she rose, each step toward the witness chair heavy. The oath passed her lips, firm but quiet. "I do." The lawyer wasted no time. "State your occupation." "I was hired as a maid." The courtroom murmured. He repeated the word slowly, almost savoring it. "A maid. And yet, you claim to care for these children." "I don't claim," Naomi said, her voice steady. "I do." The lawyer's smile was sharp. "Do you hold a degree in child psychology? Formal training? A license as a governess?" "No." "Any professional credentials at all?" "No." He turned toward the judge, spreading his arms. "No training. No qualifications. Nothing but sentiment. Nothing but presumption." He faced her again. "What gives you the right to raise another woman's children? To step into a role you are utterly unfit for?" Naomi's hands trembled in her lap, but she lifted her head. Her voice carried, quiet at first but with a strength that grew as she spoke. "No one hired me to raise them. I was brought into that house to scrub floors, to clean windows. But one night, the children cried. They begged me not to leave. And I stayed." She glanced at Alexander, then at the judge. "You ask what qualifies me? Nothing on paper. No title. No degree. But when Max raged, I didn't rage back, I listened. When Miles refused to speak, I stayed beside him until he drew his first word. When Margot trembled in the dark, I held her until she slept. And when everyone else walked out, I stayed." The gallery grew still. Naomi's voice quavered, but she pressed on. "I've lost a child myself. I know the hollow ache of grief. I know what it is to beg for someone to stay and be left alone instead. I couldn't save my own. But I could stay for them." A tear slid down her cheek, though her voice was unshaken. "You want to know what makes someone fit? It isn't money. It isn't titles. It's the courage to stand in the storm and not run. That's what I did. That's all I did. And that's all those children need." The silence after her words was thicker than any gavel strike. The lawyer, unsettled, attempted to recover. "So you admit you are unqualified?" Naomi met his gaze. "Unqualified to impress you, maybe. But not unqualified to love them." Whispers rippled again, this time with sympathy. The lawyer sputtered, but the judge raised a hand. "That will do." Naomi stepped down, her legs weak but her head held high. When she returned to her seat, Alexander turned to look at her. For once, the ice in his eyes had melted into something she had never seen before: respect. The judge adjusted her glasses, her voice deliberate. This case is not about wealth. It is not about social standing. It is not even about credentials. It is about the welfare of 3 children who have endured loss. Her gaze swept the room, lingering on Naomi. Stability is not found in gilded walls or prestigious names. It is found in presence, in consistency, in love. Miss Clarke has given these children something this court cannot ignore. To remove her now would cause further harm. She lifted the gavel. Custody shall remain with Mr. Vance. This ruling recognizes not only his rights as father, but the undeniable role Miss Clarke has played in their stability. The gavel fell. The sound cracked through the room, final and unyielding. Margaret Ellison's face blanched. Charles clenched his jaw. Their lawyer leaned in, whispering about appeals. But Naomi barely heard them. Her heart was pounding too hard. Beside her, Max grabbed her hand and whispered, "We won." Miles tucked himself against her arm, silent tears streaming down his face. Margot climbed into her lap despite the crowded benches, burying her face against her chest. Alexander stood, tall and quiet, his expression unreadable. But his eyes met Naomi's, and in them she saw it clearly: she had been the anchor that saved them all. Outside, reporters swarmed, shouting questions into the chaos. Naomi shielded the triplets as they hurried into the car, her arms strong and steady around them. Inside, away from the flashing bulbs, peace settled over the 4 of them. Alexander sat across, watching them in silence. For the first time, he understood what the court had declared in words he would never admit aloud. He had won because of the maid he once dismissed. Because she stayed. The mansion felt different in the weeks after the ruling. Not immediately, not with fireworks or parades, but in subtler ways, the kind of changes only those who lived inside its walls could notice. The air no longer rang with tantrums every hour. The halls, once echoing with slammed doors, hummed with quieter rhythms, laughter spilling from the nursery, pencils scratching over paper, the soft thud of a ball bouncing across the garden. It wasn't peace, not entirely. But it was a beginning. For the first time since their mother's death, the triplets began to sleep through the night. Naomi could hardly believe it herself. The children who once woke with screams and sobs now dozed with steady breaths, their small bodies curled in the safety of blankets she tucked in herself. And yet, despite the ruling, despite the quiet progress, Naomi never allowed herself to relax fully. In the back of her mind, a whisper remained: what if it all fell apart again? One evening, after a long day of gardening, homework, and negotiations over piano practice, Naomi found herself in the nursery. The triplets had demanded she sit between their beds until they fell asleep. She sat on a small wooden stool, holding Margot's hand with her right and Miles's with her left. Max, the defiant one, had pretended he didn't need her touch, but his foot pressed lightly against her shin under the blanket, his silent way of asking her not to move. "Don't leave," Margot murmured, her eyelids heavy, her curls spilling across the pillow. Naomi stroked her hand gently. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." Miles, usually the quietest, whispered too. "Promise. Promise." Their breathing deepened, their hands limp in hers as sleep finally claimed them. Naomi sat there for several minutes, unwilling to break the spell. She had seen them sleep before, of course, but not like this. Not with such peace, their brows smooth, their small mouths curved in the faintest hints of contentment. It was the kind of peace children should have had all along. She bent down and kissed each of their foreheads in turn. "Rest well, my loves," she whispered. And when she turned to leave, she found Alexander standing in the doorway. For once, there was no anger in his eyes. No sharpness in his posture. He leaned against the frame, his arms folded loosely, watching her with a look she couldn't quite name. Something softer. Something almost unguarded. "They've never slept like that before," he said quietly. Naomi's breath caught. They just needed someone to stay. Alexander stepped into the room, his gaze flicking between the sleeping children and the woman who had become their anchor. He lowered his voice. "Naomi, I owe you more than I can ever say." She shook her head. "You don't owe me. You owe them. Your children." He hesitated, then walked closer, stopping at the foot of Miles's bed. For a long moment, he stared at his son, then at Max, then at Margot. The weight of his guilt sat heavy in his shoulders. "I failed them," he whispered. "I failed her. And I failed you." Naomi turned to him, surprised by the rawness in his tone. "You haven't failed me." "Yes, I have." His voice cracked, the words rushing out like a dam breaking. "I mistrusted you. I fought you. God, I even tried to believe you were the problem, when all along, you were the only one holding this family together. You were right, Naomi. I hid behind money. Behind control. And in doing so, I abandoned them." For the first time, Alexander's eyes brimmed with tears. He did not wipe them away. He let them fall. Naomi's chest tightened. She wanted to comfort him, but she stayed still, letting him speak. "I can't change the past," he continued, his voice low and hoarse. "But I want to do better. For them. For myself. For you." Her breath trembled. "Then start by being here. Not as the tycoon, not as the man society whispers about. Just as their father." Alexander nodded slowly. "I can do that." His gaze lifted to her again. "If you'll stay with us." Naomi froze. The words hung in the air, more intimate than he seemed to realize. He hadn't said it as an employer asking an employee to remain. He had said it as a man afraid of losing the one person who had restored what he thought was gone forever. She swallowed. "If they want me here, I'll stay." "They want you," he said simply. "More than they want me sometimes." The admission cut him, but he didn't run from it. He stood there, stripped of his armor, and Naomi felt her heart shift in a way she hadn't expected. In the weeks that followed, life inside the mansion grew lighter. The triplets, once infamous for chaos, now filled the halls with art projects, laughter, and the occasional mischievous prank, though even their mischief carried warmth instead of despair. Naomi and Alexander began to find a rhythm too. Where once there had been confrontation, there was now collaboration. He listened more. She challenged less. Slowly, trust stitched itself between them. And one afternoon, as Naomi read aloud to the children in the library, Alexander interrupted, not with criticism, but with an idea. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice tentative, "about what you told the court. About children needing someone to stay." Naomi looked up, cautious. "There are thousands of children like mine," Alexander said. "Orphans. Foster children. Children whose parents are present in name but absent in reality. What if we created something for them? A foundation. A home. A place for healing." The triplets perked up, curiosity shining in their eyes. Naomi's heart swelled. "You mean, a center?" she asked softly. "Yes. A place where staying isn't a luxury. Where love isn't temporary." Naomi studied him for a long moment. This was not the man who had once snarled at her for overstepping. This was someone different, someone transformed by the very children he feared he had lost. "I think," she said at last, "that would be the best legacy you could give them. And their mother." Alexander nodded. "Then we'll do it. Together." That night, Naomi found herself once again in the nursery, the triplets tugging her down to sit between their beds. This time, though, Alexander joined her. He sat awkwardly at first, unsure where to put his hands, until Max reached for him. Then Miles. Then Margot. Within minutes, father and maid sat hand in hand, each with two small palms clinging to them. The children drifted off like that, peace woven into their breaths, their faces untroubled by nightmares. Naomi glanced at Alexander. He was staring at the children with a look that broke her heart and mended it at the same time. She whispered, "This is what staying looks like." He met her gaze. "And this is what family looks like." For the first time in a long time, Naomi allowed herself to smile. Not the polite smile of a maid, but the soft, unguarded smile of a woman who had found her place. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was home. Naomi Clarke, once dismissed as just the maid, had done the unthinkable. She had stayed. And in staying, she had rebuilt what grief had torn apart. Not just the children. Not just Alexander. But a family. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. What did you feel about the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this story touched you. Your support helps us bring more profound stories to life.